At 8,051 meters, Broad Peak is often described as one of the easier 8,000-meter peaks. That description may be exactly what makes it dangerous. There is no massive icefall like Everest, no notorious bottleneck like K2, and no single technical obstacle that seems impossible from below. Yet on July 30th, 2026, around 9:30 in the morning, Nims Dai was caught in an avalanche between Camp 2 and Camp 3, far below Broad Peak's summit. For a climber who had already conquered all 14 of the world's 8,000-meter peaks, this mountain was supposed to be another chapter. Instead, it became the final one. Welcome to Ben Stories. To understand why Broad Peak could take someone as experienced as Nims Dai, you have to forget the word easy. Broad Peak rises to 8,051 meters on the Pakistan-China border, only about 5 kilometers from K2. It is the 12th highest mountain on Earth, and its name is almost disappointingly simple. British explorers in the 19th century called it Broad Peak because of the mountain's unusually wide summit ridge. But that width is more than a geographical curiosity. It is part of the problem. The summit ridge stretches for roughly 1.5 kilometers, with several distinct high points before the true summit. A climber can reach what looks like the top, only to discover that the real summit is still farther away. And at more than 8,000 meters, farther away can mean the difference between a controlled descent and a dangerous race against time. The standard west spur route also creates a dangerous illusion. From a distance, Broad Peak appears relatively straightforward. Compared with K2's enormous walls or the complex icefalls found on Everest, its lower slopes can look almost inviting. There is no single obstacle that announces, "This is where the mountain will stop you." Instead, Broad Peak distributes its hazards: weather, avalanche exposure, altitude, crevasses, long summit days, and perhaps most importantly, the descent. That pattern has appeared repeatedly throughout the mountain's history. In 1957, Hermann Buhl and Kurt Diemberger were part of the team that made Broad Peak's first ascent. Buhl was already a legendary figure after his extraordinary solo ascent of Nanga Parbat. Decades later, Reinhold Messner would describe the 1957 Broad Peak expedition as far ahead of its time. But Buhl's story also became an early warning about the mountain environment. In 2013, another generation of elite climbers arrived during a Polish winter expedition. On March 5th, Maciej Berbeka, Tomasz Kowalski, Adam Bielecki, and Artur Małek set out from high camp. They reached the summit in brutal winter conditions. The achievement was historic, but the descent became the real test. Berbeka and Kowalski did not return to high camp. That story matters because Broad Peak repeatedly demonstrates the same uncomfortable principle. Reaching the summit is only half the expedition, and sometimes it is not even the hardest half. For Nims Dai, that lesson would become painfully relevant decades later. But before July 30th, 2026, he had already spent years proving that conventional limits did not apply to him. And that is where this story becomes much more complicated. Nirmal Purja did not arrive at Broad Peak as an ordinary climber. Born in Nepal's Mayagdi district and raised in Chitwan, he later built a career in the British military before turning his attention toward the highest mountains on Earth. His reputation was forged not simply by reaching summits, but by doing it at a pace that seemed almost impossible. In 2019, Purja launched Project Possible. The objective was extraordinary: climb all 14 mountains above 8,000 meters in less than 7 months. The traditional benchmark had been measured in years. Purja did it in 189 days. By October 2019, he had completed the challenge, creating one of the most remarkable records in modern high-altitude mountaineering. But that was not the end. He later became part of the historic first winter ascent of K2 in January 2021, another achievement that strengthened his image as a climber, willing to operate where the margin for error was extremely small. So when Nims Dai returned to Broad Peak in 2026, this was not his first encounter with extreme altitude. He was attempting something even more ambitious, another complete ascent of the 14 8,000ers. A third round. That objective changes the psychology of the expedition. For a first-time climber, the summit may represent the ultimate destination. For someone who has already climbed every 8,000-meter peak multiple times, the question becomes different. How much risk is acceptable when the achievement itself is no longer about proving you can reach the summit? And that question becomes especially important on Broad Peak. The mountain's west spur is not relentlessly technical from bottom to top. Instead, it exposes climbers to a collection of hazards that can become serious when combined. The approach to base camp begins near Ascole and takes roughly 8 to 10 days, depending on conditions. The route passes through the Baltoro Glacier and Concordia, one of the most extraordinary mountain landscapes on Earth. Here, K2, Broad Peak, and several other giants dominate the horizon, but beauty offers no protection. Broad Peak Base Camp sits around 4,900 meters. From there, climbers gradually move upward through Camp 1, Camp 2, and toward Camp 3 at roughly 7,000 meters. And between those camps lies the problem. The mountain can look stable, while the snow above the route is not. The Karakoram is notorious for rapidly changing weather. A clear morning does not guarantee a clear afternoon. A summit window can shrink from several days to a matter of hours. Expeditions may spend weeks waiting for the right conditions. Then, suddenly, everyone moves. That creates another paradox. A narrow weather window brings climbers onto the same mountain at the same time, increasing exposure precisely when the environment offers the least room for mistakes. And on July 30th, 2026, the critical question was no longer whether Nims Dai could climb Broad Peak. It was whether Broad Peak would allow him to continue. At approximately 9:30 in the morning, somewhere between Camp 2 and Camp 3, an avalanche struck. He never reached the upper mountain. That detail is crucial. The mountain did not defeat him at the summit ridge. It happened much lower down, on terrain that many climbers might consider part of the approach to the real climb. And that is the first major lesson of Broad Peak. The most dangerous moment is not always where the mountain looks most frightening. The avalanche between Camp 2 and Camp 3 changes the way we should look at Broad Peak. At roughly 6,000 to 7,000 meters, the mountain is already operating in an environment where the human body has very little reserve. Above 6,000 meters, acclimatization can reduce some of the effects of altitude, but it does not turn the environment into something safe. Every movement costs more. Recovery takes longer. Decisions become increasingly important. And Broad Peak adds another variable: snow loading. The west spur can look broad, smooth, and relatively uncomplicated from below. But a mountain does not need to look steep to be dangerous. Snow can accumulate on slopes above a route, especially after storms or periods of shifting wind. When that snow becomes unstable, the climber below may have almost no influence over what happens next. This is why experienced mountaineers often describe avalanche terrain in terms of exposure rather than simply difficulty. A technically difficult section can sometimes be managed through skill, equipment, fixed ropes, and careful movement. An unstable slope above you is different. Your climbing ability cannot negotiate with gravity. and Broad Peak has demonstrated this before. In 2018, an avalanche near Camp 2 claimed the life of Icelandic climber John Snorri's expedition partner. More broadly, avalanche danger has remained a recognized hazard on the lower and middle sections of the mountain, particularly after significant snowfall. The important point is not that Broad Peak is constantly collapsing. It is that the mountain does not need to be constantly dangerous. It only needs to become dangerous during the short period when climbers are exposed. That distinction is critical. A mountain can be statistically manageable and still contain moments that are almost impossible to predict perfectly. And this is where the reputation of Broad Peak becomes controversial. Calling it one of the easier 8,000ers is technically understandable when comparing the route's climbing difficulty with some of its neighbors. But technical difficulty and overall risk are not the same thing. A mountain can be easier to climb and harder to survive. That may be the better description of Broad Peak. Consider what happens later on the route. Above Camp 3, climbers approach the saddle around 7,600 meters. Beyond that lies steeper terrain, and eventually the summit ridge. The route becomes increasingly exposed, and the true summit is separated from an intermediate high point by additional ridge travel. That means the summit day is not simply Camp 3. Climb, summit, return. It is a long chain of decisions. Every hour spent above 7,000 meters increases fatigue. Every delay reduces the time available for descent. Every unexpected change in weather can turn a calculated plan into a completely different problem. And Broad Peak has another psychological trap. The summit can appear closer than it really is. A climber reaches the rocky summit around 8,028 meters and may feel that the objective is essentially complete. But the true summit is still farther along the ridge. In good summer conditions, that final traverse can take another hour or more. Then comes the part that history repeatedly warns climbers about. Going down. Maciej Berbeka learned that lesson in 2013. Kim Hongbin learned it in 2021. And Hermann Buhl's story had already shown, decades earlier, that reaching the top of an 8,000-meter mountain does not mean the danger has ended. But Nims Dai never reached that point in 2026. His story ended before the summit push. And that creates the most uncomfortable question of all. If one of the world's most experienced high-altitude climbers can be caught on the lower route, what exactly does experience protect you from? The answer may be less comforting than people want to hear. Experience can improve judgment. It can improve preparation. It can help you recognize danger earlier. But it cannot remove the mountain's uncertainty. And on Broad Peak, uncertainty may be the real summit. There is another reason the Broad Peak story deserves more attention. It is not simply a story about an avalanche, or about one climber, or even about one mountain. It is a story about the limits of human confidence. Nims Dai had spent years building a reputation around pushing those limits. His 2019 Project Possible expedition demonstrated that speed, organization, physical preparation, and experience could radically change what was considered achievable in the high Himalaya. But the mountains never signed that agreement. They do not recognize records. They do not recognize fame. And they certainly do not care how many 8,000-meter summits someone has already completed. That sounds obvious. Yet it is one of the easiest principles to forget when watching elite mountaineering. The more successful a climber becomes, the more tempting it can be to interpret previous success as evidence that the next objective is manageable. Broad Peak exposes that logic. Its danger is not concentrated in one spectacular wall. It is distributed across the entire route. At around 4,900 meters, climbers begin at base camp. Around 5,900 to 6,000 meters, the route becomes more serious. Camp 1 and Camp 2 provide higher staging points. Then comes the long transition toward Camp 3, near 7,000 meters. Every altitude milestone reduces the amount of oxygen available to the body. At sea level, atmospheric pressure allows the lungs to transfer oxygen efficiently into the bloodstream. At extreme altitude, the problem is not that the air contains dramatically less oxygen by percentage. The problem is pressure. There is simply less oxygen pressure available for the body to use. That distinction matters because a climber can be highly fit and still be operating under severe physiological constraints. Then add cold, wind, fatigue, dehydration, sleep disruption, difficult terrain, and unpredictable snow conditions. The risk is cumulative. One factor may be manageable. 5 factors arriving together can change everything. This is why the idea that Broad Peak is an easy 8,000er can be dangerously misleading. Easy compared with what? K2? Perhaps. But that comparison can create the wrong mental picture. A mountain does not have to be the hardest technical climb in the world to be lethal. Broad Peak's real challenge may be that it gives climbers fewer obvious warning signs. The mountain can appear climbable. The route can appear straightforward. The weather can look acceptable. And the summit can still be many hours away. That is precisely why the 2015 decision of an experienced team to turn around after encountering unstable snow is worth remembering. Walking away from an 8,000-meter summit is not failure. In mountaineering, sometimes it is the clearest evidence of judgment. The controversial question is whether modern climbing culture always rewards that judgment. Social media rewards summits. Records reward speed. Sponsors reward visibility. Audiences remember the photograph at the top. Almost nobody celebrates the climber who turns around 200 meters below the summit because conditions have changed. Yet that decision may be the most important one of the entire expedition. And this is where Nims Dai's final Broad Peak story becomes uncomfortable. His experience was extraordinary. His preparation was extraordinary. His previous achievements were extraordinary. But none of those things could guarantee a safe passage through avalanche terrain. According to the timeline described in the reports surrounding the July 30th, 2026 incident, the avalanche struck at approximately 9:30 a.m. between Camp 2 and Camp 3. Not at 8,051 meters, not on the summit ridge, not during a dramatic final push, much lower. That is the detail that should stay with us, because it destroys one of the most persistent myths about high-altitude climbing, that the closer you get to the summit, the more dangerous the mountain becomes. Sometimes the opposite is true. Sometimes the greatest danger is waiting on a section that looks ordinary, a slope you have crossed before, a route that appears familiar, a morning when the weather seems acceptable, and then conditions change. That is why the greatest survival skill on an 8,000-meter mountain may not be climbing faster. It may be recognizing when the mountain has changed and having the discipline to change your plan with it. Broad Peak leaves us with a lesson that has little to do with records and everything to do with judgment. For decades, climbers have approached this 8,051-meter mountain because it appears, at least from a distance, more manageable than its famous neighbors. But Broad Peak has repeatedly demonstrated that technical difficulty is only one part of mountain risk. The real danger can hide in the spaces between the obvious challenges. A changing weather system, fresh snow on an exposed slope, a narrow summit window, a long descent after the body has already spent its reserves, a seemingly simple section encountered at exactly the wrong moment. That is why the story of Nims Dai should not be reduced to the idea that an easy mountain killed an elite climber. The more important lesson is that there is no such thing as an easy 8,000-meter mountain. There are only mountains with different combinations of risk. Nims Dai had already accomplished what most climbers could only imagine. He had climbed all 14 of the world's 8,000-meter peaks in just 189 days. He had stood on K2 in winter. He had accumulated experience at altitudes where small mistakes can become major problems. Yet experience never becomes immunity. That may be the hardest truth in mountaineering. The mountain does not care about your resume. It does not care whether you are climbing your first 8,000 ER or your 42nd. It does not care how many records you hold. It only presents the conditions that exist at that moment. And the climber has to make a decision with incomplete information. That is what makes high-altitude mountaineering so fascinating and so difficult to understand from the safety of the ground. We see the summit photograph. We see the flag. We see the celebration. But the real story is often hidden in the decisions made before that photograph ever exists. When to continue, when to slow down, when to turn around, when the weather is no longer acceptable, when the snowpack is no longer trustworthy, and when ambition has begun to outweigh judgment. Perhaps that is the real contradiction of Broad Peak. The mountain looks broad, open, and comparatively simple. But its danger is precisely that it does not always announce itself. The lesson is not to fear mountains, it is to respect uncertainty. Because on an 8,000-meter peak, survival is rarely about one heroic decision. It is about making hundreds of small decisions correctly, and understanding that sometimes the smartest decision is to stop. If you found this story valuable, subscribe to Ben's Stories for more true stories from Everest, K2, and the world's most dangerous high-altitude environments. Thank you for watching. Take care, stay curious, and I'll see you in the next video. Reaching the summit is optional. Coming back alive is not.